The leader everyone is afraid of is not always the strongest leader in the room. And Dodgeball accidentally proves that because White Goodman looks like the obvious boss. He's intense, confident, controlling, and fully convinced fear is a winning leadership strategy. But Peter LaFleur, the guy who barely looks like he's running anything, is the one people actually know, like, and trust. And that's the lesson. If you want to build real influence at work, stop asking, how do I get people to respect me? And start asking, do people trust me enough to follow me when things get tough? Welcome to Movie MBA, where I take movies we all know and love and use them to break down real-world business lessons, especially around getting seen, building influence, and actually getting ahead at work. So if that's your thing, make sure you follow now because I'm going to be doing a lot more of these. And today we're starting with Dodgeball. I know, it's ridiculous and not exactly what you'd expect to find a leadership lesson in, but stick with me because there's actually a really good one in here. Now, you've got two coaches. One leads with fear, the other leads in a way that makes people actually want to show up for him. And somehow the guy who looks the least like a boss on paper is the one who builds the team that actually wins. Because White Goodman thinks control equals leadership, and Peter LaFleur doesn't really try to look like a leader at all, but people trust him anyway. Now, let's bring this into the workplace because this is where the lesson actually matters. You don't need a manager title to lead the way Peter does. And you don't need a manager title to accidentally lead like White either. Leadership isn't just your title. Leadership is how people experience you. It's how you show up when something goes wrong. It's whether people feel safer or more stressed out after talking to you. It's whether you create clarity or just more noise. Because we all know someone who has influence without the title. They're the person who people go to when they need a real honest answer about what's going on. They're the person who can calm down a messy situation. They're the one who helps the team figure out what actually matters. That is leadership. And we also know people with the big titles who somehow make everything harder. They don't clarify, they escalate. They create confusion and then act surprised when everyone's confused. They ask for updates every 17 minutes and call it accountability. So the question is not, am I officially in charge? The question is, do people trust me when the work gets hard? Because that's where influence is built. Fear-based people can get movement in the short term. I'm not going to try to pretend they can't. Fear can make people respond. It can make people scramble. And it can make people appear productive, but fear does not make people honest. And that's a problem because when people are afraid of you, they don't bring you problems early. They don't ask clarifying questions. They don't say, I don't think we're solving for the right thing here. They don't admit, I need help. They wait. They practice their responses. They protect themselves. And by the time you hear the truth, the problem has grown way bigger than it should have been allowed to get. And that is bad leadership. Peter's style works differently. He's not perfect, and that's great because good leadership doesn't require you to be some polished, all-knowing corporate genius. Peter works because people feel like they can be real around him. They can be weird, they can be nervous, they can be the underdogs, and he still sees value in them. That's what good leaders do. They don't just manage performance, they create the conditions where people can actually perform. So let's make this useful. If you want to be the kind of leader that people actually trust, whether you have the title or not, here's what you can start doing right away. First, stop trying to prove you're the smartest person in the room. That's White Goodman energy. Everything's a performance. Every conversation feels like a dominance contest. Like you have to win the room even when nobody else is competing. At work, this shows up when someone always has to have the last word. They correct tiny details to feel important. They turn simple questions into lectures. They make people regret opening their mouths. Don't be that person. Real influence grows when people feel safe bringing ideas to you. So instead of trying to sound smart, try to make the room smarter. Ask, what are we missing here? Who sees this differently? What would make this easier to execute? Those are leader questions. Second, be close enough to the work to understand the cost of your request. This is a big one because there's nothing more dangerous than a leader who is far away from the work but very close to a deadline. That's where chaos is born. So if you're going to ask people to move fast, understand what you're asking them to move. If you're going to change priorities, understand what gets pushed. If you're going to say, can you just get this done by Friday? Understand that just is usually where the bodies are buried. A good player coach does not need to do everyone's job, and don't try to do everyone's job. That's not leadership. That's how you become exhausted and mildly resentful. But you do need to understand enough to make better calls. Ask what's blocked, what needs to be decided. Ask what can come off the list if this new thing is now the priority. That is how you build credibility. And third, don't confuse silence with alignment. This is where a lot of leaders fool themselves into thinking, well, nobody pushed back, so we must all agree. Maybe everyone's just decided that this is not the safest meeting to tell the truth in. Silence can mean agreement, but silence can also mean people have learned that honesty is expensive. So if you want real trust, you have to reward people for telling the truth early, not just when it's convenient. When someone flags a problem, don't punish them for being the messenger. When someone asks a question, don't make them feel stupid for needing clarity. When someone says, I'm concerned that this won't work, don't treat that like negativity. Sometimes that person is saving you from a much bigger mess. That's the person you want speaking up. Fourth, know your people well enough to lead them like humans. I know it's a radical concept, but people are not just resources. And yes, I know that companies use that word in business, but that doesn't mean you have to treat them like chess pieces. Good leaders notice people and their personalities. Who needs time to think before answering? Who's quiet but usually right? Who's overloaded but too responsible to admit it? Who's ready to take on more but needs someone to open the door for them? Who gets dismissed because they don't self-promote well? That's a leadership skill. And you can do it from any seat, at any position. You can be the person who pulls someone into the next conversation. You can be the person who gives credit out loud. You can be the person who says, actually, that was her idea. You can be the person who helps the room see the people who usually get overlooked. And that is influence. And finally, keep your standards without making people afraid of you. This is where people get weird about leadership advice. They hear be trusted and they think it means be soft. No, trust does not mean you have no standards. Peter still wants to win. Average Joe's is still trying to save the gym, right? Good leaders still hold people accountable. They still say when something is not good enough. They still make hard calls. The difference is they don't make people feel small in the process. There's a line in Dodgeball. If you can dodge a wrench, you can dodge a ball. It's funny, right? A recommended employee development strategy, it is absolutely not. And yet some workplaces basically run on metaphorical wrench throwing. Last-minute fire drills, public call-outs, unclear expectations, moving targets. Then everyone acts shocked when people are stressed and making mistakes. You can challenge people without humiliating them. You can raise the bar without constantly moving it. You can expect excellence without creating emotional chaos. That's the balance. So here's the real lesson from Dodgeball. White Goodman is constantly trying to prove he's in charge. Peter LaFleur does not try very hard to prove anything, but people follow him anyway. The characters illustrate the radical difference between authority and influence. Authority is what your title gives you. Influence is what people give you after they decide to trust you. And if you want to get seen and get ahead at work, influence matters way more than you may realize, because the people who move up are not always the loudest. They're not always the ones with the most impressive titles. They're often the people others trust when things get messy. They're the ones who can bring calm to chaos. They can get people aligned. They can tell the truth without setting the room on fire. They can push the work forward without making everyone miserable in the process. That is leadership. And you do not have to wait for someone to hand you a team to start practicing that. Start in your next meeting. Make one thing clearer. Give one person credit. Ask one better question. Tell the truth earlier. Stop performing certainty when what the room actually needs is honesty. And pay attention to what happens when you walk in. Are people glad you're there, or are they bracing? Because that answer will tell you a lot. At the end of the day, Dodgeball is ridiculous. It's a bunch of grown people playing middle school game in spandex. But underneath all of that, the leadership lesson is pretty straightforward. The goal is not to be feared. The goal is to be trusted enough that people will follow you when things get uncomfortable. White Goodman performs leadership. Peter LaFleur earns trust. So who do you want to lead like? Follow me here and on Instagram at Selfmade Senior for more breakdowns like this, where I take movies we love and love to hate and pull out the business lessons hiding inside them.